All right, Rabosai, good morning. Good morning. Baruch Hashem. Welcome. Welcome, Zachinu, to have completed Maseches Ksuvas. Baruch Hashem, this morning to have the incredible schos to begin Maseches Nedarim. It's so beautiful to see so many here at the start of Shir, so special and so beautiful. Also, Chaver in the back, no one has to sit so far back. You could feel free. There's plenty of seats up here as well. Not going to take anyone's makom or anyone's space. It's always more exciting when we're all a little bit more tzafuf together. So we'll say, let's begin Emir Sasha by thanking the sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Yanki and Eliza Statman and Yitzi and Rebecca Statman for dedicating the shiurim this month in commemoration of the first yard site of Menucha Shendel Yehudis Bas David Yosef. To thank Shmuel Rabin Karabkin for dedicating the shiurim this month in commemoration of the 25th yard site of Rabin's mother, Melanie Solomon. Is that too loud? Thank you. Pasamira Bas Chaim Zichron Livracha. To thank our week of learning sponsors. Sorry. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Avi Zeisman, in commemoration of the yard site of his grandfather, Avram Ben Aaron Zichron Livracha. To thank Tzvi and Shane Dishir for dedicating the shiurim this week in honor of the Kehila. To thank Shmuel and Shira Pepper for dedicating the shiurim this week in honor of Ari Lerner and all he does for the shul. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, David and Malki Kramer, in honor of the Daf Yomi Shir Chevra, and in honor of all of the Magidei Shir on completing another Masechta. Hakar Satov to all of the Magidei Shir for their encouragement to participate in this current Daf Yomi cycle, as well as the encouragement to continue learning Daf Yomi each and every day. Thank you to all of our sponsors for their incredible generosity and for Baruch Hashem, for the beautiful messages. With that, let us begin. Shechianu v'kiyamanu v'hegianu lazman hazeh. To begin a new Masechta, there's always an excitement in the air. When it's a new Daf Yomi Masechta, always an excitement in the air. When Baruch Hashem, we have a new haschala. There's just something beautiful, something tangible that you could feel. And the truth is, we're going to have an incredible, magnificent journey in Maseches Nedarim. I will say, just before we get started with the Masechta, before we jump into the Mishnah, just two quick words of introduction. So you're going to see, first of all, Amir Hashem, the dapim are shorter. That's number one. Right? So we're actually going to have a chance to remain on the same Daf Yomi cycle as the rest of the world. That's number one. Now, what Rabbi said, just point out one of the interesting changes that we're going to see in Maseches Nedarim is that whereas in most Masechtas, the go-to perush is Rashi, so Nedarim is a little bit different. According to almost everyone, Rashi in Maseches Nedarim is not actually Rashi. It's actually commonly referred to as the Mefaresh. It's attributed to, it's a machlokas exactly whose perush it is, or a compilation of a number of different perushim. But in Maseches Nedarim, Rashi is not considered to be the go-to Mefarish. Instead, it is the Ran. So the Ran, again, on the left-hand side of the page, so you'll notice, again, is much more loquacious than Rashi. So one of the interesting adjustments we'll have to make in this particular Masechta is we're going to go through that. We're going to be using the Ran, although sometimes we will reference, we'll call it Rashi also, we'll reference Rashi as well, but the Ran is really going to be our go-to. Now, the beautiful part of it is, on one hand, the Ran is much longer. On the other hand, you're going to see the Ran is an extensive perush on Maseches Nedarim. So there's going to be a real opportunity here to have a running perush on the Masechta that really gives us a comprehensive understanding. The difficulty I think we'll run into a little bit is that sometimes you'll see that we're not going to do Ran necessarily again from beginning to end the entire time, so we'll have to jump around a little bit. But Amir Hashem, you'll enjoy it. I will say just one other word of introduction as we come to Maseches Nedarim. So as one could imagine, the topic of our Masechta over here is Nedarim, is a Neder. So I will say just by way of introduction, there's a beautiful idea by the Sas Emes, and the Ger Rebbe quotes the pasuk in Bamidbar Perek Vav Pasuk Beis, and the Torah writes as follows: Dabra b'nei Yisrael ve'amarta aleim. Speak to the Jewish people and say to them, Isho Isha kiyafli lindar neder nazir lahazir laHashem. So the topic of conversation over here in Parshas Naso is the nazir. Now, nazir is the paradigmatic example of a neder, right? Of a neder, which we'll loosely translate as vow. So the Sas Emes makes an interesting observation. How do you translate that pasuk? Again, this is Bamidbar Perek Vav Pasuk Beis. Dabra b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleim. Speaks to Jewish people, say to them, Isha, man or woman, kiyafli. How do you translate the word yafli? So ultimately, again, if you look in the art scroll, right, if you look in the Chumash, Yafli is translated as articulate. If a man or a woman will articulate a Nazarite vow, says the Ger Rebbe, says the Sasam, is something so beautiful, that the shoresh of Yafli is Pella, is wondrous. And the Sasema says that the most incredible Pella in this world, the most incredible Pella in life, is the ability to affect change through the spoken word. You see, sometimes we think that the only way to affect change is actionally, right? The only way I could affect change, the only way I can make change in this world is through my actions. And we think words are just words, right? Words don't necessarily, do you hear me? Yeah. Words don't necessarily matter. Right? Words don't have the ability to affect change as much. But the greatest Pella, sometimes the most incredible thing is the ability to affect change through one word. And I will say, this is true on halachic level, it's true on a hashkafic level, that sometimes, again, you look at, we'll see examples of this. A person makes a neder. What's a neder? A neder are words. And words, a sentence strung together in a particular way could fundamentally change the trajectory of a person's life, could fundamentally change the trajectory of the lives of those around us. That's a Pella. That is a Pella. That is something absolutely amazing, overwhelming, and wondrous. And I will say we know this, of course, again, in a hashkafic level as well. Words, what we say to a spouse, how we talk to children, how we interact with friends, the word usages, the word choices we make, the tone we choose to take, fundamentally alters the nature and the fabric of our relationships. Says the Sasamas. That's why the Torah Kadosh uses the lashon of Yafli, Pella. It is amazing to see how much change could be affected by the spoken words. So I will say one of the incredible pieces of Musar that we'll have to take with us as we go through Maseches Nedarim is to work on our koach hadibur, or to work on our appreciation of speech, and to recognize that sometimes, we're not careful with how we talk, or we're not careful with when we talk, or we're not careful with what we talk about. And part of the sensitivity which we will hopefully pick up and glean and bolster and reinforce within ourselves over the course of the journey of this beautiful Masechta, is how meaningful, how purposeful, and how powerful each and every word truly is, and how Mir Hashem we should be zocheh to live our lives in a way which reflects that. I will say with that akdama, let us begin now. Shechianu v'kimanu v'gana. I will say you have to, right? You feel it, right? You feel the energy, even at 5, and well, now it's already 6:03, right? Even at 6:03 in the morning, right? You feel the energy of a brand new Masechta. There's something exciting in there. I will say, let's begin. Kol kinui nedarim ki nedarim. So I will say, interestingly enough, the Mishnah begins with a discussion, as I mentioned before, about nedarim. So let's just translate the words, then we'll get into the Ran. So kol kinui. So I will say, kinui literally means like a nickname. We're going to see the translation that's often given for kinui is a similar term. So we're going to see that sometimes you could explicitly articulate a neder, and sometimes you could use verbiage that is similar to an explicit articulation of a neder. That's called a kinui. The same way that a nickname, right, is not your actual name, but it's similar to your name. So a kinui neder is an articulation that is similar to an actual neder, but does not have the same exact verbiage as an neder. We'll say, let's take a look. Our first Ran are so exciting. You always remember your first Ran, right? So let's say, so take a look. Beis Amud Aleph, left-hand side. So again, I apologize in advance. We're going to be jumping through the Ran a little bit, so you'll follow me along this. So Rashi says, the Ran says over here, Kol kinui nedarim, what's on the left-hand side? Neder hu be'echa mishnei inyanim, im nidrei hekdish shu makdish lebed kabayis, olam mizbeach be'inyan zeh, enu yachol lahakdish el mashu shalo, v'isur kol adam, o nidrei iser. So we'll say, sha'asr al atzmo dvarim hamutarim. So we're going to see, and this is very important, the Ran. And I would suggest, by the way, that if you're going to do a little bit of chazara, and by the way, these dapim are short enough that you could spend 7 minutes on chazara and just run through it. If you have a couple of extra minutes, the Ran is a beautiful, and actually, it's a pretty easy read if you go through it, because we're not going to get to do everything. So the Ran says like this. Number one, there are two different types of Nedarim. In the world of Nedarim, two types of Nedarim. Number one, what we call Nidre Hekdish. What is Nidre Hekdish? Nidre Hekdish means you make a neder consecrating something to the Beis HaMikdash or to Bedek HaBayis. Again, we'll get into all of this. But neder number one is I make a neder and the power of my vows, I've made something the property of the Beis HaMikdash. Then says the Ran, 3 lines into the Ran, O Nidre Isser. Second type of neder is what we call Nidre Isser. What does that mean? Sha'asr alatzmo dvarim hamutarim. A Nidre Isser means I take something that is permitted and I go ahead and I make a neder not to partake of this particular item. So I make a neder not to eat a loaf of bread, right? Not to go ahead and eat milchiks, whatever it is. It's inherently permitted. I make a neder not to partake of it. Ube'inyan zeh, good. So we'll say, so now skip a little bit. Umesechazu hi be'inyan nidre iser. So we'll say, so the Ran points out that our point of departure in the world of Nedarim is not with what we call nidre hekdish. We're not really talking about right now making something the property of the Beis HaMikdash. Rather, we're much more focused on nidre iser. I'm making a neder to prohibit something to myself. Now, we'll say skip down a little bit. So you see in the right across in the first line of the Mishnah, actually, where it says kinuye in the Mishnah, the nidre iser. You see that line in the Ran? Good. The nidre iser heim echad mishlosha drachim. So now says the Ran. So now the Ran is very organized. Now we have two categories of Nedarim. Right? Category number one, Nidre Hegdish. Category number two, Nidre Isser. Good. In the world of Nidre Isser, so he says Nedarim can manifest themselves in 3 different ways. Nidre Isser, heim be'echad mishlosha drachim. Ikar haneder. So once we're going to Ikar haneder, just means a good old-fashioned, completely, explicitly articulated neder. That's number one. Number two, kinuyav, which means a similar term neder, and yados. Yados, Rabbi say, we will see means a partial statement, but a partial statement that is understood enough to go ahead and create a bona fide neder. So now the Ran explains each of these very quickly, Rabbi say. He says, Ikra, I might be the only person who can't get through Daf Beis in Nedarim. I know in the Shir. Okay, good. So the Gemara says this house is embarrassing already, 607. Okay, good. So the Gemara says this Ikra haneder, well, we'll get through it, it's short. Ikra haneder, hu sheyomar davar ze asr alai. So we'll say, so Ikra haneder, but this is very important. Ikra haneder is I say, this loaf of bread is asr to me. They'll say, so again, Nidre Isser, remember we're leaving aside now Nidre Hekdish, leaving that aside. So Nidre Isser, so I say again, this loaf of bread is Asr to me. That's called an Ikar Neder. We'll say, why is it Ikar Neder? Fully explicit, fully articulated, leaves absolutely nothing to the imagination. Skip down a little bit. We'll say, so now in the wide lines, 3rd line into the wide lines of the Ran, right after the period. You see that? Vikinuyav. So I'll say, so now I know that's Ikar Neder. What's a kinui? Vikinuyav. Hushebemakom karban yomar konam. So we'll say an example. Now it's interesting. He's giving the example from Nidre Hegdish. So we'll say, so if let's say I was making something the property of the Beis HaMikdash, right? Nidre Hegdish. So what I would say is, this loaf of bread is like a karban to me. That would be like an Nidre Hekdish. So I'm equating the status of the loaf of bread with a karban. Just like a karban is aser, right, to me, for benefit, so to this loaf of bread. And that would be an explicit net. What's kinui? For example, shomokom karban hu yomar konam. Konam, I use an equivalent or similar term. So I say, konam alai kikar zu, right? This kikar should be konam. I don't know, what does konam mean? Right, konam can mean a lot. So there was this, again, we'll get into this, but this is the example of a kinui. So I use a similar or equivalent neder term, but don't explicitly articulate the neder. So that's a kinui. Rabbi say now skip down in the Ran even more. You see Rabbi say all the way towards the end of the Ran, you see where the Ran, v'charamim kecharamim starts? You see that? 3 lines up from that at the end of the line. The yados nedarim, what's a yad? The yados nedarim hu, shemaschil b'miktsas diburo shal neder. So I will say, so a yad is a partial declaration, a partial statement. That's where I begin a neder articulation. Ela she'ino gomer oso, but I don't fully articulate it. So the Gemara says, ve'ino gomer oso, miktsas hadibor, Noder kalashim sadibra. So we'll say that the power of a yad is that even a partial declaration has the ability to affect a complete neder. So therefore, we'll say pivotal ran, pivotal ran. So now what do I get from this ran? Number one, two categories of nedarim. Neder number one is what we call nidrei hekdish, which we're not really discussing right now. Category number two, nidrei isser. Nidrei isser, good. Within nidrei isser, the truth is we're going to see within nidrei hekdish also three different categories. Iker neder, which means a fully explicitly articulated neder, right? Number two, a kinui, a similar or equivalent neder term, which affects a complete neder experience. And number three, yad, which is a partial declaration. Beautiful. Let's do the Mishnah. Kol kinui nedarim ki nedarim. So we'll say, so therefore, what is the Mishnah telling me? Any kinui, any similar or equivalent neder term has the ability to affect the neder. So we'll say, again, the chiddush over here is, I might have thought that the only way to go ahead and create a real neder is how? Complete, explicit articulation. Kamash malam, no. There's a concept of a kinui, concept of a yad, which again is equivalent or similar or partial declaration. Good. So kol kinui nedarim ki nedarim. So we'll say, therefore, if you make only a similar or equivalent statement of a neder, that has the ability to affect a full neder. Similarly, v'charamim kecharamim, u'shvuas kishvuas, u'nazirus kinazirus. And I both say the same halacha doesn't just apply to neder; it applies to a cherem. And I both say, what's a cherem? What's a cherem? Right? This sounds like hataras nedarim. Right? What? Right? What's a cherem? Go back to the ran for just a moment, right where we left off, the middle of the ran in the wide lines. V'charamim kecharamim kilomar sha'omer nechasim elu alav cheref harehu ki'ilu amar nechasim elu alav cherem v'hemasula. So we're going to see cherem is a lashon of something is usher to me. So again, we'll discuss what each of these actually mean. But normally I would say, this loaf of bread is cherem unto me. Okay, so that will affect an isser. Even if I use a kinui, a similar or equivalent expression, and the Ran gives a similar equivalent, so the similar or equivalent expressions of a cherem are able to affect a cherem. So just like a kinui neder is a neder, a kinui cherem is a cherem. Similarly, you have a shvua, an oath, and I will say we'll get into this as well. If you look at Rashi, the Ran, shvuas kishvuas, kilomar de kinui shvua, hariu kishvua v'chayla. So we'll say ultimately an equivalent term of, so in other words, if you use a similar or equivalent term for a shvua, a kinui shvua also has the ability to affect the shvua. Again, I will say we'll see examples of all this, but this is the principle. Good. Similarly, again, Nazirus. So we'll say Nazirus we're a bit more familiar with. A person goes ahead, you can make a Neder Nazirus, or you can make a Kinui Neder Nazirus. If you use a Kinui, a similar or equivalent term, that affects Nazirus as well. Beautiful. The Mishnah gives a case. Ha'omer lechavero, a person says to his friend, Mudrani mimcha, Mufrashani mimcha, Miruchukani mimcha. Shabbos say, if a person goes over to his friends and he literally uses this lashon, mudrani, I am nedered from you, right? He's using it as a verb. I'm nedered from you. Mudrani mimcha, mufreshani mimcha. I'm separated from you. Mirichukani mimcha. I'm distanced from you. Shani ochalacha, shani talmimcha. In other words, Shabbos say, saying those terms by themselves doesn't mean anything. You have to attach that to something. So what the guy is saying is, I'm mudrani from eating your food. I'm mudrani from drinking your drinks. I am separate. I'm mufreshani from your food. I'm mufreshani from your drinks. I'm distanced, miruchukani, from your food or from your drinks. What's the halacha? Aser. So we'll say that is a case of iser. Now, I just want to point out, skip to the end of the Ran. 3 lines up from the bottom. The Ran writes, Omer alechaveru mudrani mimcha, b'gimar mefarish dahainu yados. Now we'll say, we're going to see a big problem. What's the problem? See, I will say, remember, the Mishnah, this is going to be the Gemara's first question, but the Mishnah is describing the concept of kinui. Let's remember again, what's kinui? What's kinui? Right? Equivalent. Good. Similar or equivalent terms. This is actually an example of a yad. What's a yad? Going back to what's a yad? Partial declaration. Because I will say, if you notice over here, the guy is only saying like a half a statement. I'm mufreshani from your food and drink. What does that mean? What does that mean? That's a yad. So I'm just pointing out, again, and the Gemara is going to jump on this. Here you introduce the Masechta with telling me that a kinui neder is like a neder, and then you give me an example not of a kinui, but of a yad. So again, the Ran already says this. He says, Mefarish b'Gemara dahainu yodos. Good. So good, fine. So we'll say, so that's the case. That's the example. Let's finish the Mishnah. So what about menuda anilacha? We'll say, what about the lashon of menuda anilacha? Now, what does menuda mean? What is menuda? I'm excommunicated to you. Nidui. I'm excommunicated. So we'll say, so what is the power of a statement like that? What is that? What is that? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva hayachochech bazeh lahachmir. So literally, you're going to say also an interesting lashon here. I will actually direct you to Rashi, even though, as I mentioned in the introduction, this is not Rashi. So if you look, but again, if you look at what's called Rashi, Rabbi Akiva hayachochech, the last lines on the right hand side, havamechachech lahachmir. So Rabbi Akiva will say, chochech literally means like turmoil or struggle. Rabbi Akiva struggled with this, and in other words, what do I do with the lashon of menuda? And he came out l'chumra. The aser nami the inyan nederhu below barurle. So Rabbi Akiva wasn't exactly sure what to do with the lashon of menuda. What exactly is it? And therefore, ultimately, he came out l'chumra, that if you make a lashon of menuda ani lecha, that affects a neder. Now, what is that? Is that a yad? Is that a kinui? Again, we'll get into in the Mishnah. Good. So we'll say, so now again, mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov. We finished our first Mishnah in Masechet Nedarim and Amud Aleph. Amud Aleph, incredible. Now I will say, now again, so just hold on, and I apologize, we don't have notebooks today, but hopefully by tomorrow we'll have notebooks. And I will say, just keep in mind the structure. Two different types of Nedarim, Nidrei Hektish, Nidrei Isser. Again, in Nedarim itself, three different levels of Nedarim. Iker Nedarim, explicit, complete articulation. Kinui Nedarim, similar or equivalent expressions. And Yodos, partial declarations of Nedarim. The Mishnah teaching us that Mishnah seems to be hyper-focused on kinui, that similar or equivalent expressions have the ability to create a full-fledged neder. Beautiful. Good, I will say, Amud Beis. Beautiful, beautiful Gemara. So the Gemara says, I will say, Arkasha, Kol kinui nedarim kinedarim. So I will say, actually, before the Gemara gets into our question, the Gemara says, I don't understand something. The Mishnah, the structure of the Mishnah, right? This is Maseches Nedarim. As such, as one could imagine, the topic of Maseches Nedarim is Nedarim. Excellent. So we'll say, but yet, what does the Mishnah do? The Mishnah begins by saying, Kol kinui nedarim nedarim. So, right, any kinui, right, any partial, any equivalent or similar expression affects a complete neder. And then it says, by the way, what is true by nedarim is also true by charamim, by shvuos, and by nazirus. The Gemara just picks out on something interesting. So, kol kinui nedarim ki nedarim, maishna gabe nazir, delo katani lehu lekulhu, umaishna gabe nedarim diktani lekulhu. So, both say the Gemara is intrigued by this. Why? Because a similar Mishnah appears in Maseches Nazir. If you look at the Ran, right-hand side of us, look at the Ran. Maishna gabi nedarim diktani kulu, kilomar, vilu Maseches Nazir, lo tana ella, kinuye nezirus kinezirus. So here's what's very interesting. So in Maseches Nazir, there's virtually the exact same Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says that when it comes to nezirus, kinui nezirus is like nezirus. But in Nazir, it doesn't include all of the other categories, right? It just says a kinui nazirus is like nazirus, but then it doesn't say, and the same thing applies to Nedarim, Charamim, and Shavuos. So why is it that in Maseches Nedarim, even though our topic over here is even though our topic are Nedarim, yet we include all of the other categories where kinui is the equivalent to the Iker, and yet in Maseches Nazir, we only talk about Nazir and don't include all the other categories. I will say, one's asking it's a stylistic question. It's common for a Mishnah to espouse a principle, and the principle is being espoused in regard to a particular area in Halacha, but once we're espousing the principle, we'll also talk about the other areas in Halacha where the principle applies, right? So that's what's happening over here. Kinui Nedarim is like a neder, and by the way, it's not just by Nedarim, it's also by Shvuos, Charamim, Nezirus. That makes sense. Yet in Maseches Nazir, it only articulates the principle by Nazir and doesn't include other categories. Why is that? To which the Gemara says, furthermore, why is it that in Maseches Nazir, when the Mishnah says that a kinui nezirus is like a neder nezirus, and it doesn't include all the other categories where kinui works. Umayshna gabe nedarim diktani lakulu. And yet, why is it over here that by nedarim in our Mishnah, the ikar statement Rabbi says the opening line of the Mishnah, right? Kinui kol kinui nedarim ki nedarim. Done. That's our topic. That's our topic. Yet the Mishnah goes on to say, by the way, what's true with nedarim is also true with charamim, shvuas, nazirus. So why here do we go into all the categories, and why in Nazir don't we go into all the categories? Just a simple stylistic question. Very simple. To which the Gemara says, Mishum, the neder ushvua ksiv gabe hadadi. It's very simple, says the Gemara. Neder and shvua are written together in the Torah. If you look at the Ran says over here, second line on the right-hand side, neder ushvua ksiv gabe hadadi. The Ran writes, the ksiv ki yidar neder laHashem Ohishava Shvua. So Rabbi say the Torah itself writes about neder and shvua together. Literally translated, if a person will make a neder to Hashem or will make an oath. So neder and shvua are biblically linked. They're biblically intertwined. So therefore again, so mishum the neder shvua ksiv gabi hadadi tani tartim. So if Rabbi say wherever you're going to talk about neder, right in the Mishnah is also always going to include what? Always going to include what? Shvua. Especially when the halachas are the same. So we'll say it's actually a fascinating Gemara because we're stylistically building up the Mishnah. So what I have over here is like this. What I have, number one, is, okay, the topic is Nedarim. So now I've learned halacha number one. Anytime you make a kinui neder, that's like a neder. Fine. But neder and shvua are biblically linked. So now, by the same halacha applies to shvua. So because it applies to shvua, we'll also put that in the Mishnah. Therefore, any kinui shvua is like a shvua. So now I understand why shvua is included. Okay, now watch this. The chayvan the tani tartin tani lakulu is interesting. So now the Gemara says, by the way, so once you've already mentioned two, you might as well make it a party, right? In other words, once you've already mentioned two, you might as well include the other, we'll call it verbal mechanisms as well, verbal frameworks as well. So once you already, in other words, we'll say, once you already have neder and shvua, you might as well include the other mechanisms as well. So tani lakulu, good. So therefore we'll say good. So that's interesting. So that's it. That's the style of the Mishnah. So I want to point out, so interestingly enough, Naziros, even though Naziros is also a form of a neder, but as we're going to see, you already see from the Mishnah, Naziros is looked at as its own entity. Because we're going to see Naziros as more Maseches Nazir, but Naziros really has its own unique aspect. So therefore, the Mishnah Maseches Nazir, which is Dafka just talking about Naziros, fine. So there the Mishnah says, a kinui Naziros is like a neder Naziros, and done. Here in our Mishnah, we're talking about Nedarim. So once you're about Nedarim, you're going to bring in Shvuah because they're biblically linked. Once you have Nedarim and Shvuah, you might as well bring in the rest of the items as well about Charamim and Naziros as well. Beautiful. So says the Gemara, Velisne kinui Shvuos basar Nedarim. So Rabbi say, if that's the case, here's the problem. Rabbi say, stylistically, how is the Mishnah set up? The Mishnah says, any kinui Nedarim is like Nedarim. The same halacha applies to Charamim and Shavuos and Nazirus. But here's the shaila. Why don't you change up the order? Shouldn't Shavua come after Nedarim in the Mishnah? Why is Charamim put there in the middle between Neder and Shavua? You know, we're just getting technical just about the style of the Mishnah, right? If the whole reason you're bringing in Shavua is why, because it's mentioned in the pasuk together with Nedarim, so I would have thought that Shavua should be mentioned in the Mishnah right after Nedarim. Number 2. Why is it number 3? To which the Gemara says, it's very interesting. Aidi the Tanabosai, by the way, one of the most important lines in the entire Masechta, and it's only the first day of the Masechta. Aidi the Tana Nedarim the Misarchefza alei, Tana Nami Charamim the Misarchefza alei, Lafuki Shvua the Ka'asar Nafshe Minachef. So, wow. Now let's say, here we go. One of the most important distinctions for the next couple of Masechtas, Rabosai, is the Isser Gavra versus Isser Chefza. So Rabosai, let's talk about this in just a moment. What is the difference between a neder and a shvua, a vow and an oath? So Rabosai, here the Gemara explains it. Let's talk about this outside, then we'll get to it inside in just a moment. Rabosai, when a person makes a neder, what they are doing is they are creating an Isser Chefza. I am creating a state of prohibition upon an object. Now, obviously, it's about the relationship between myself and the object. So now, that object is usher to me. is usher to me. Right? Now we'll say, so that's called an Isser Chefza. There is a layer of prohibition that devolves upon the object itself. Versus Shvuah. They both say, when you take an oath, what is an oath? An oath, ultimately, again, is an Isser Gavra. Is a prohibition. We spoke about this actually a little bit on Shabbos Shuvah. Right? An oath, right? The Shvuah is an Isser Gavra. It is a prohibition upon me. So we'll say, just to illustrate this very simply, when you take a neder, let's say a person says, right, I'm taking this loaf of bread should be asur upon me. They will say, what is the neder devolved upon? What is the neder devolved upon? The bread. Now, obviously, it's devolved upon me also, right? But lamaisa, the prohibition of the neder is upon the loaf of bread, which is why, can I get another loaf of bread? Absolutely. Why? Because the prohibition was only on that particular loaf, an isser chefza. A shvuah, on the other hand, Rabbi say, is I take a shvuah not to eat bread. What is that shvuah upon? What is that shvuah upon? Me. And therefore, which loaves of bread does it apply to? All of them. Rabbi say, underline if you're using your own Gemara, right? Underline this, because this is incredibly important. So let's just read this back into the Mishnah for just a moment. So now watch this. Remember again, Rabbi say, follow the flow. We're trying to figure out, why does the Mishnah discuss anything more other than Nedarim? Right? This is Maseches Nedarim. So now I understand. We have to bring in Shavuah. Why? Because Shavuah is mentioned in the same pasuk as Nedarim. So you're going to speak about Nedarim, speak about Shavuah. Fantastic. What about Charamim and Naziris? Well, once you've already mentioned Nedarim, if you already mentioned Shavuah, you might as well bring in Charamim and Naziris as well. Okay, but why not mention Shavuah right after Nedarim in the Mishnah? To which the Gemara says, here we go. So the Gemara says, "Aidi detana nedarim de misr cheftzale." So we'll say, so once we mention nedarim, a neder is an isr cheftzah. The prohibition devolves upon the object. Tana nami charamim de misr cheftzale. So we'll say, as we're going to see, cherem is also an isr cheftzah. Cherem also creates a level of prohibition upon the object itself. Lafuke shvuah de ka'asr nafshei min cheftzah. As opposed to Shvuah, ultimately again, which is an Isser Gavra. Right? Literally, the Lashon over here is, Da'afuke Shvuah de ka'asr nafshei. I prohibit myself from the particular items. Therefore, I will say, going back to the Mishnah, so again, therefore, we start out with Nedarim, but once you're already in the world of Isser Cheftzah, we're going to include now what? Charamim, which is also an Isser. And I will say, we don't really know fully what a Cherem is. But now, okay, it's in the orbit of Nedarim, so it's going to be an Isser Chavtza. After we finish with the Isser Chavtzas, what do we go to? Shvuah, which is an Isser Gavra. Now, I will say, according to this logic, it sounds like, what is Nazirus? Also an Isser Gavra. Again, well, that's the way it sounds like stylistically. But again, we'll get into that. I will say, I'll just mention something incredibly beautiful. I will say, so this, by the way, this chilik of Isser Gavra, Isser Chefza is one of the, first of all, in general, it's one of the most profound chakiras, one of the most profound distinctions you'll find in Shas about Isser Gavra versus Isser Chefza, and also the Iker distinction between a neder and a shvuah. Again, a neder being an Isser Chefza, the prohibition devolves upon the object, versus a shvuah, which is an Isser Gavra. So Rebbe said the Avnei Nezer, the Sakhachaver Rebbe, has a beautiful, beautiful insight on this. And he says, the truth is, this applies b'derech hashkafa as well. He gives an interesting example between Isser Gavra and Isser Chefza. He says, for example, an Isser Gavra, a good example of this would be, he says, shkatzim v'ramasim, right? Eating non-kosher items, right? Creepy, crawly things, non-kosher animals. That's an Isser Gavra. It's an Isser Gavra. He says, what is that? What does Isser Gavra mean? He says, an Isser Gavra are things, I'm better than this. I'm better than this. Right? Isser Gavra means that there are things that I should not do because they're beneath me. They're beneath me. I'm better than this, right? And maybe once upon a time I did these averos, but I've graduated past, or at least I should graduate past that. So it's an Isser Gavra. I'm a Gavra. I'm someone who is special. I am someone who is holy. I am someone who is accomplished. I am someone who means something to this world. And by definition, there are certain things that are beneath me. There are just certain things that I should not be doing. The Avnei Nezer calls that Isser Gavra. Isser Gavra. So what's Isser Chefza? So he gives an example, by the way, of an Isser Chefza. Isser Chefza would be an example of Zar Sha'achal Kodesh. Let's say you have a non-Kohen who ate Truma. I will say, now what's the chap of a non-Kohen who eats Truma? What's the chap of that? In other words, I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready for that, right? I'm not a Kohen, and therefore I'm not holding on that particular level. So says the Adonai something amazing. The same way that a person has to know what's beneath them, it's beneath me. A person also has to realize in the quest for a spiritual accomplishment, what is not yet within reach. Sometimes the greatest mistakes, it's interesting, sometimes the greatest mistake we make in Ruchnius is becoming a little bit of an overachiever. Now, I feel very awkward saying that because we're all about overachieving. But I will say, a person has to be an overachiever, but you have to be an overachiever for things that are shaykh. A simple example, if a person says, you know what, the first daf of Maseches Nedarim was so good, I'm giving notice today, right? That's it. I'm going to make my life Kula Torah. I will say, do not do it. Do not do it. But 1 second, isn't that the goal? No, that's not your goal, right? Your goal is to go to work. Your goal is to make a living, support your family b'kedusha b'tara with an honest living, right? And ultimately, again, carve out time in your each and every day for beautiful ruchni accomplishment. To quit my job, essentially, again, secede from the natural world and become, seclude myself and closely based on medrash. That's not our tafkid. That might be that might be the tafkid for other people, but that's not our tafkid. Right? That's not. I'm talking us. I'm talking us, me and you. That's not our job. And if I were to do that, essentially what I'm doing is I'm overshooting. I'm overreaching. Says the Sasamis, that's called an Isser Chefza. That chefza, that's not yet for me. Maybe one day it will be. Maybe one day. Right now, that's not what it is. It says that it's such a beautiful insight. It says the Abnei Nezer. There's an Isser Gavra, which in life are the things that are beneath me. I'm better than this. I'm a Gavra, and therefore I should not do these things. And the Isser Chefza, things that are beautiful, but they're not necessarily shaykh for me. And life is all about knowing what's an Isser Gavra and what's an Isser Chefza. Back to the Gemara. So ask the Gemara, our Kasha, Pasach Bikinuyin. So I'll say, remember again, I mentioned this in the Mishnah, right? The style of the Mishnah doesn't seem to flow. The Mishnah began with a discussion about kinui. Again, remember, what's a kinui? Right? A kinui, remember, again, is similar or equivalent terms. But then the example that the Gemara gave, umefarish yados. The example the Mishnah gave was an example of a yad. What's a yad? Partial declaration. Mufreshani mimcha, merichukani mimcha, ha'omer lechabeiro, moder ani mimcha. So the Gemara says, Visu yados inshi. So the Gemara says, what happened to yados? You started with a discussion, ultimately again, about kinui, and then you went to yados. What's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Ayri bahon v'chisrei mechsera. The truth is, there's a piece of the Mishnah that's missing. I both say, the truth is, the Mishnah is really talking about both kinui and yad. Both kinuyim and yados. So the Rose say, here's the Gemara. Here we go. Balchi katani, kol kinuyim nedarim kinedarim, v'yados nedarim kinedarim. Oh, I say, now I have it. Now, one little line was missing. So how is the Mishnah supposed to read? The Mishnah is supposed to read, any kinui of a neder is like a complete neder. So again, remember again, kinui, similar or equivalent terms. Any similar or equivalent term to a neder is like a neder. Similarly, again, any yad, any partial declaration of a neder is also like a neder. And then what does the Mishnah do? Then the Mishnah goes into giving an example of a yad. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. The lifrosh kinuin beresha. But stylistically, so essentially, here's the style. Style is kinui yad, introduced to kinui yad. This is that missing line. Kinui yad. And then our Mishnah gives an example of what? Of a yad. So says the Gemara, I don't understand, why don't you follow the flow? If you're first talking about kinui, and then talking about yad, the first example you should give is kinui. So the Gemara says, no, no. Hahu disalik minei, hahu mefarish beresha. No, the truth is, there's a different Mishnaic style. The Mishnaic style often says like this, I will say, when you're discussing A and then B, often the Mishnah will first have the discussion about B before A. Why? Because since I'm in B, right? I'm in B. So therefore, I will say in our Mishnah, we spoke about kinui, then we spoke about yad, or now we found out we spoke about yad. So therefore, once we're talking about yad, let's talk about the example of yad. In other words, once we're already in B, let's just fully talk about that. And the Gemara gives examples. We'll say a whole bunch of examples. And we'll run. We'll say, what are you allowed to light the Shabbos candles with? What can't you light the Shabbos candles with? I will say, how does the Mishnah go on? Right? Ein madlikin. So I will say, again, here you see stylistically, the Mishnah talks about, here are the things you can light with, here are the things you can't light with. Ein madlikin. The first discussion is what? About what you cannot light with. I will say, what's the style? The style is A, B, talk about B. Right? You're already in B, talk about B. Another example. We'll say, what can you insulate? Remember, hatmana, which represents, again, the prohibition of insulating on Shabbos, without getting into everything, we're just going to read through these examples. We're not really going to wade into them. What can you insulate with on Shabbos? What can't you insulate? Again, A, B, what can you insulate with? What can't you insulate with? You can't insulate with the following. So you see the structure of the Mishnah, talk about A, talk about B, further discuss B. What could a woman go out with on Shabbos? Again, Masechah Shabbos, the issue of Hotzah. What are we concerned about? That a woman may come to carry in Rosh Hashanah. So what could a woman go out with? What can't she go out with? Lo seitzei isha. A woman should not go out with. So the Gemara is making an argument that Mishnahically, the structure of the Mishnah is that whenever you have a Mishnah talking about multiple things, A and B, often what will happen is when we get into the world of examples or further explanation, we'll first begin to explain B and then go back to A. Since we were already in B, we'll just continue that train of thought and then go back to A. So therefore, we'll say, based on this, our Mishnah reads as follows. Our Mishnah introduces us to Nedarim with what? With a kinui. But now I know Chisrei Mechsra, there was a piece of the Mishnah man saying, what did the Mishnah teach me? That kol kinui in Nedarim ki Nedarim. Any kinui of a Neder is like a Neder. Then what was the second line of the Mishnah? And any yad of a neder is like a yad. And then, by the way, once we get now into the examples, we give an example of a yad before we go into kinuyim. Beautiful. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Is that true, by the way? Is that always the style? Is that always the style? That wherever the Mishnah begins with a discussion of A and B, we first give the examples of B before we go back to A. I'll give you other examples. Vatnan. Listen to this. Yesh nochalin umanchilin, lo nochalin velo manchilin. There are some people who inherit and bequeath, and other people who inherit and don't bequeath. Ve'elu nochalin umanchilin, and these are the people who inherit and bequeath. So I will say, what's the structure over here? A, B. Go back and first explain A. Similarly, yesh mutaros lebalein v'asuros liyivmehen. And Rabbi say some people get a little bit of a twitch whenever we go back to Yavamis, right? So again, there are some women who are mutter to their husband, but usher to the Yavam. Mutter to the Yavam and usher to the husband. And then when the Mishnah goes into the list, and these are the women who are permitted to their husbands and usher to the Yavam. Once again, A, B, go back and explain A before B. Another one. Yesh tu'unos shemen ulavona. So there are some, we'll say, some carbon minchas which require shemen and lavona, oil and frankincense. So shemen velo lavona. Others require shemen and not lavona. The elu tu'unos shemen ulavona. And these are the ones which require shemen. Once again, it's like I said, when we're not wading into the substance of these examples, but just showing you, the Gemara is just saying, it's not true. You brought me a whole bunch of examples, 5 examples of a model of what we'll call ABA, which means introduced to A, introduced to B, ABB, right? That was the first model. Introduced to A, introduced to B, and then continue discussion about B. The Gemara says, I'm just going to bring you a whole bunch of examples of ABA, where I talk about A, talk about B, and then go back and give the examples of A. Another example, Yesh tu'unos hagasha ve'ein tu'unos tenufa. I will say there are some. This once again is carbon mincha. There are some carbon minchas, some menachos, that require hagasha. We'll say the Ran, by the way, 3 lines up from the bottom over here. Tunos hagasha, sheyagish hakoines hamincha bekeren dromis ma'araves. We'll say there are some carbon minchas which require being brought to the southwest corner of the mizbeach. That's called hagasha, but they do not require tenufa. They do not require waving. However, there are some that have to be brought to the southwest corner of the Mizbeach, but don't require waving. Tenufa v'lo agasha. Some that require waving, but don't require being brought to the southwest corner. Ve'elu te'unos hagasha. Here are the ones who require being brought to the southwest corner. Once again, right? Introduced to A, introduced to B, give the examples about A. Another, also, Gemara is piling this on. There are some examples of a person who could be a bechar, a firstborn, for inheritance purposes, but is not a firstborn for pidyon haben purposes. Bechar lekohen, ve'im bechar lenachala, or a person who is a bechar for pidyon haben, but not a bechar ultimately again for inheritance. So we'll say A, B, and now what happens? Ve'ezu bechar lenachala, ve'ezu bechar lenachala, ve'im bechar lekohen. What's an example of someone who's a bechar for inheritance, not a bechar for pidyon haben? So we'll say, so again, what do you see over here? Just to kind of hold cup on this. So remember again, what were we bothered by? We were bothered by why the Mishnah is talking about kinuyim, right? Very quickly, about kinuyim, but then gives an example about a yad. So we answered that up. How do we answer that up? Chisuri mechsura. There's a line missing from the Mishnah. The Mishnah actually reads, kinui neder is like a neder, and yad neder is like a neder as well. Beautiful. And therefore, again, what does the Mishnah do? The Mishnah gives the example of a yad. Why? The Gemara posits, because the way Mishnayos are set up is when you're talking about A and B, after we speak about B, once we're already in B, we'll give the examples of B. And the Gemara brings a whole bunch of rayas to that. Now, I'll say the problem is the Gemara brings a whole bunch of rayas the other way. Many Mishnayos that are set up in what we'll call an A-B-A model. Talking about A, right? Introduce me to A, introduce me to B, and then give me the examples of A before you go back to B. So what's going on? To which the Gemara says, you're right. To which the Gemara says, Halein mishum da'av shulei mefaresh. The Gemara says, mefaresh hahu de pasach bereisha. So we'll say, if you take a look, the Gemara explains as follows. The Gemara says, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. In this, the issue over here is Halein mishum da'av shulei mefaresh hahu de pasach bereisha. So the Gemara says, in this any situation where there are many cases, that's what it means. Halein mishum da'av shulei mefaresh hahu bereisha. In any situation where there are many examples, that's ultimately, again, what we will put at the forefront. In other words, whichever case, or whichever situation has more cases associated with it, that's what we'll start with. So the Gemara says, I baha b'meh behema yotze u'ma'ena yotze delo avsha v'katani yotze gamal. I will say, what about the cases as follows? What about the Gemara talks about, this is what an animal could go out with, this is what an animal can't go out with, where you don't have many cases, and yet, again, you begin, so you begin with Yotze Gamal, the case of A first. So in other words, the Gemara wanted to suggest that ultimately, again, when do you follow an A-B-A model? When A has a lot of cases. When A has a lot of cases, the Gemara just says, but in this Mishnah and Shabbos, where again, Behema Yotzama, what does an animal go out with? What doesn't an animal go out with? Where there aren't a lot of cases, and yet we'll still state A to begin with. To which Shabbos the Gemara says, top of Gimel, Elalav Dafka. But here's the answer. The Gemara says, you're right. You're right. Zimnin de mefaresho de pasach bereisha, v'zimnin hahu de salik mefaresh bereisha. The Gemara says, you're right. It's just there are two models. There are two models. Sometimes the Gemara will use one model. Sometimes the Gemara, I shouldn't say the Gemara, the Mishnah. Sometimes the Mishnah will use an A-B-B model. Sometimes the Mishnah will use an A-B-A model. And that's it, right? Zimni mefarisha de pasa bereisha, zimno de savra. Now, we'll say, now what's interesting about this is, according to this approach in the Gemara, it doesn't necessarily sound like that there is a rhyme or reason. Just stylistically, sometimes the Mishnah will go one way, sometimes the Mishnah will go a different way. Now, could there be a reason in each particular Mishnah? Absolutely. But the point that the Gemara is making is, there isn't necessarily, in other words, both are valid models. So that's why, again, V'harayo, you'll find both models in different places. I will say just quickly, let's finish up. The other possibility is, Yodos, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up with this Ibai Seyam Amir Hashem tomorrow. I will say, I just want to end up just one last. If you notice, by the way, a very solid first Amid of the Gemara. I will say, literally, 7 minutes of Chazara, you could go through this entire Amid. 7 minutes. I know most of us start each new Masechta with the promise of Chazara. It lasts about a day and a half, right? And then just, the Daf Yomi train, it's like a bullet train, right? And I can't, I will say, again, don't worry about tomorrow. Right now, you can Chazar this Daf in 7 minutes. I will say, even if I'm just Kona, Maseches Nedarim Daf Beis, That's an incredible accomplishment. Rabosai, Mazel Tov, such a schus to begin this Masechta with you. Mazel Tov, an exciting journey ahead. Shkoyach. Yeah, they're still talking.
Now, that's whichever style you want. Is it necessary to say that there is a phrase missing from the Mishnah?